Welcome to part 2 of a brief history of work stress, and let's talk about man and stress. Stress was first coined by Hans Selye in 1936 as a physiological non-specific response to any situation that demands change. And Walter Bradford Cannon came up with another explanation of stress, which was under the fight or flight pattern, which is an evolutionary trait of man and most mammals or animals, which is a response to fear or uncertainty. And so this evolutionary trait basically means that in light of a danger or a threat, we generally choose to either flee or choose to have any physiological symptoms that are characterized by the fight or flight response, as Bradford Cannon has called it. And so if it is true, and if stress is really an evolutionary trait that we've acquired from our ancestors and acquired in our genes, then it is also true that man has always been prone to some kind of stress and stressors around him. And so we can say that early man as a hunter-gatherer was also stressed by the uncertainty of finding food or the threat of having a predator while he's finding food. And so we talked about the adverse conditions that workers worked in. Large portion of late 19th century and early 20th century, we saw a large chunk of people everywhere working in factories and working in mines. They were obviously faced with uncertainty and threat. I mean, mine workers were always prone to some kind of casualty, right? And people working in sweatshops were also prone to unhygienic conditions and threat to life. But they also had other fears. In spite of this stress, they had another stress in their personal lives, which was to provide for family and to survive. And so the fear of poverty or sickness dominated the fear of dying at a workplace. And so men and humans continued working in spite of the perils of working. And so there is a need to examine the incentives of work and why people continue to work. The first incentive obviously is income or salary or wage, which obviously helps to pay for resources, for food, for physical survival. It helps afford a lifestyle, so social survival, and people depend on work for money, so which is an important factor in our lives today. The second incentive is role integration or personality development, which is a more recent discovery but a very psychological concept, and it describes work as being sort of conducive to development in personality, facilitating growth, facilitating some kind of discipline, sense of purpose in young people. And so we looked at stress as a sort of coming with feelings of uncertainty and fear. And in order to understand work stress, we need to look at workplaces as causes or sources of uncertainty and fear. So what are the risks to these incentives that people have from work? So what are the risks to income, for example, would be financial crises or economic crises. There's a market crash, then companies can get shut down, they are forced to fire people. And so, you've got many factors where people depending on work for income can be affected by these issues. Stress risks to role integration can involve having toxic work environments, employer bullying, being underappreciated, being underutilized, and so basically anything can cause role conflict and role ambiguity in big companies, because big companies can have large projects, global scale, and then people are distanced from the company's vision and their purpose within the company, so that can cause role ambiguity because you don't know what you're playing. So even if you're a project manager or a general manager, then you are one manager among several, and so that can cause role ambiguity and has been studied widely. Now there are several assessments and evaluations that have taken place over the last several years, and companies hired, generally they hire these HR firms or freelance divisions that can make these surveys or questionnaires to make the workplace a better environment for the worker. And so there was a study being made recently about supervisor support in companies, which can give rise to just having a better work environment and reducing stress among workers and making them feel like they belong and making them feel like they are being productive. And so these studies have been involved in that. But again, you have to look at big companies through a large sort of perspective and see how distant employers are from these provisions being made for them. So they can be far distant from all these various surveys and questionnaires that are actually created to cater to their needs. And smaller companies will not afford decent HR firms or will not have HR divisions to take care of this. So again, people working in smaller companies are suffering from some kind of stress or trauma which adhere to being underutilized or underappreciated. Now, underutilized, you can feel underutilized because you pay for education, you pay for being specialized in something, and yet the work that is required of you is actually much lower than say your capabilities. And so people feel like they're assembly line workers essentially, and we discussed these people working in factories say 100 years ago, and they were assembly line workers. They were actually working in a small component that became just one aspect of this large company. And so more people feel like they suffer from role ambiguity and role conflicts as a result of that. So if you're making these comparisons between modern day employers and assembly line workers or miners or wage laborers or even slaves, then we have to ask a few questions, because I'm not saying that this is a confirmation of this particular comparison, but modern day corporations are big corporations. They have to maintain their basically their reputation in the corporate world, and they're big companies, so they have a set of rules, they have norms, they have laws within their premises or their building areas, and they decide the work hours, they decide the nature of work that you do, that the workers would do, that employers would do. I mean, so many people complain of being unfairly paid rather than underpaid. So you see the difference. Unfairly paid, obviously they're overworked, they're given jobs that are outside of their domain, they're being underappreciated. And so all of these factors can make humans feel stressed. And so as a result of this supposedly enslaving nature of workplaces today, people are leaving jobs and they're starting their own businesses, right? And so this is a boom that happened in the last 10 or 15 years, maybe more. People continue to leave jobs and start their own ventures in order to escape this sort of work life. But there's a study made in 2016 that suggested that it studied the burnout in basically owner managers of small startups, SMEs, and they feel occupational stress just the same as people working for workplaces and other corporations or organizations. So people who own business actually also have stress because they invest in the firm, they emotionally invest in the firm, creatively invest in the firm, they financially invest in the firm so many times. They feel like they handle all the departments, and so that becomes a point of stress. And then anything on the external side is obviously going to cause chaos and collapse. So that's another uncertainty and fear factor which basically drives even entrepreneurs to stressed out lives basically. And yeah, maybe there are a few advantages to being the owner of your own business. You can decide your own work hours and you can have, but this study generally has agreed upon the conclusion that workers and owner managers are basically going through the same levels of stress. If not, owner managers are going through more stress. And so now that we've seen the various ways that academia and literature and research have compared modern workers to assembly line workers or miners or wage laborers, let's look at a few statistics. The average salary of a laborer in 1900 was $675. Now this was a time when America was not really going through a lot of crisis. America was doing well, and so 675 in 1900 is actually $23,000 today. which is interesting because if you look at the average salary of a software engineer, it's 90,000. Legal associate is about 72,000. A graphic designer is about 60,000, and a manager is about 40,000, sort of close to those numbers approximately. And so if you look at the way the world has changed, the markets have changed, the consumer product and commodities that have come to the forefront, the things and the lifestyles that people have adopted to live, then that 23,000 actually is not so different from what people are earning today. And I mean, the CPI from 1900 has increased to about 3,400. 3,400%. The CPI has increased from 1900. And so obviously inflation has played a big part in this. And so basically these statistics suggest that the lives are really not that different. And more people are feeling unfairly paid and underpaid and overworked. But they're basically living and going through similar conditions as those people. And this is not just a political statement, or a politically inclined statement, but this is the general qualitative analysis of what I'm finding here. In India, the average earning of a person monthly is about 30,000, 40,000, and that's the average earning. And the expense is about as the same, right? Because it's very cut to cut, and then people have loans and people have like EMIs and rents and everything, and so people are really cutting it close or barely cutting it at all. Against what I mentioned, the statistics in America, the US Bureau of Labor and Statistics has suggested that the average expense of an American is 60,000. So they are also barely making it for the salary that they're making. They're also barely taking anything home. Not to mention the kind of debts that we've incurred in the sort of borrowal society that we have today, where debt is basically, and loans are promoted by banks and by corporations, and people are feeling unfairly paid with this. So another stress factor is they feel unfairly paid, and I keep stressing on this because the reason they feel unfairly paid is because obviously their qualification is more. As we specialize education, more people are actually acquiring education and qualifications that they are going to barely require when they start working, and so more people feel like they actually invested a whole lot more in education for the work that they're doing and for the purpose that they're serving within a company. And so no wonder people are stressed, and people continue to feel enslaved, and people continue to feel trapped in this new sort of life that has been created. In spite of escaping it, people still go through similar conditions even as businessmen and entrepreneurs. So work stress has prevailed regardless of the various measures. Now, we discussed all the external factors that have contributed to stress, and external factors have always changed the way people worked. So when there were fewer populations and small settlements, there was no need for hierarchical organizations. But as populations increased, the hierarchical structures at workplaces basically was the demand. And to cater to the high rising population, you needed efficiency of production and manufacturing, which was found in the Industrial Revolution and up until the last 100 years, and even today. Now we have machines doing that for us, and that's another scientific innovation that's to cater to the population explosion. Now, the other thing that happens and continues to happen is that with the increasing population, all the companies are hiring more people because more people need to work in order to provide for the increasing number of people everywhere, right? And so as more people get work in these companies, more and more people means that the salary rate and the salary that people are making is quite less than what they should be making, right? Everybody needs some kind of position, and so when people can't work and don't feel like they should work, they have their own smaller companies, and so smaller companies are basically showing up everywhere. You've got so many startups showing up regardless of what is needed and what is required in this world. And the reason for that is more people need work, more people need an income, some source, no matter what it actually is. And so this increasing population has also caused a lot of IT companies to hire more people in the last 2 years than they did in maybe 2 years combined or something. There's a few statistics of Wipro and Infosys and TCS that I have, which I will hook up. And so these ecological factors have also contributed, because as hierarchical structures become more rigid, which these companies are going to make continually as the populations increase in so many countries and as the demand for stuff increases, people are going to feel more alienated. So again, we are going back to the sort of 19th century model of this. Why workers feel depressed and stressed is because they feel alienated. They feel separated from the purpose of the company, separated from what the company holds for them. They don't enjoy the work because they feel like they're assembly line workers continually. And today it holds more true as we go back to these theories, as we go back to these notions. Now, in spite of all of this, and this was just a sweeping history of all the advancements and measures and stuff related to work and stress and work stress, I don't think I have an answer what the solution is, and I have not tried to think about it. There can never be an answer, but there can be a few things to make people feel better. So Hans Selye, when he came up with stress, was looking at stress as an adaptive response. So the reason I said it was a very unspecific form of response was because there was no positive or negative connotation to it. It was a response that had an adaptive nature. So every sort of physiological symptom that you have of stress has some adaptive quality to it. So stress is basically an adaptive trait. So let's say we evolved to adapt, because that's why we are here, and we adapt to survive. So stress in many ways is a survival response to the core. And so that might make you feel better, because that can indicate that we are in a sort of transition period, and that more people, as they think of working, we see a lot of people working on workations. They leave jobs or have multiple sources of income. They invest small in the earlier part of their lives and then eventually scale up. And so these breakthroughs are required in this transition period, and as we find that more people learn to identify the problem with the system will also have to change eventually, and somehow we'll find a ground where work can have stress, but there will be means of somehow skipping it and having an alternative to that, because currently it's only adhered to the fear of poverty or fear of dying in sickness somewhere, because those are the standards that we've set for ourselves as the world moves forward. And so this adaptive response that we've used all along can basically be used again when some other event or catastrophe or stage in human life confronts us. But for now we are in a transition period, and we don't know how long it's going to last until the next socio-ecological breakthrough solves this problem. So